My guests this morning have a brand new book out, Martin Porter and David Goggin, the book called Buzz Me In Inside the Record Plant Studios. Martin, David, good morning. I'm about halfway through the book. These stories are amazing.
You had to
Yes,
be
we
there, right?
agree.
You had to be there. And we bring you there, right?
Indeed. You know, one of the things that gets me about it is you think to the mid 60s and all of these great records that are being produced in these small studios. The Motown studio was not a whole lot bigger than a radio station studio.
Yeah.
RCA studios in Nashville, where some of those great country records recorded, very small. Brian Wilson, who just passed, you look at all of that video of him doing stuff in California with 20 musicians inside, again, a small room. And then it explodes by the mid 70s into what you have in New York and out in California.
Well, what happened was, remember, a couple of things happened. One, money started to happen, started flowing into the record business in a big way. Money brought new technology, brought expense, brought time. All right. So the ability, what was unique about the record plant was that were able to build something that exceeded the dreams and the expectations of the artists. And it also happened at the time when audio was exploding. We talk about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, there was a fourth element. It was called audio. Audio was the original technology. These guys were the original tech bros, and the ability to create environments that enabled them to create a sound and to provide them with a sonic experience was very much part of that time and very much part of that era.
Speaking of audio, one of my favorite quotes in the book, and I don't remember exactly who said it, was build me a monitor system that Bill Zimzik can't blow up.
Well, that was because of Joe Walsh. They were working on a song with Joe called The Bomber. And every day they would have like 10 of these big tannoy monitors in the studio up above the console because those guys they wanted to feel the music. And it's true. Every day they blow them up. But Chris Stone, the businessman behind it, said, "Oh, that's okay. The company will pay for new monitors." So that was a big part of the business. I mean, but eventually that request to get a monitor that couldn't be blown up by Joe Walsh and Bill Simzik was due to Tom Hidley, who also designed the rooms. And actually, that speaker that he developed is now still in use around the world. Westlake. It was the acid test at Record Plant for many things, people and equipment.
What do you think ultimately, though, led to, because so many great albums came out of these studios, what do you ultimately think led to the closing of them?
Well, listen, the era, technology, if we talk about the beginning of the era, was technology, was audio. It was the demise of the era was also was technology. These were expensive places to maintain, to equip. A tape machine was $40,000. All right, consoles were hundreds of thousands of dollars in the early days. So uh, they were unique in the early days because they enabled the artists to create. They were built to serve the artists. People were hired to serve the artists and to create a sound that they couldn't experience. Well, by the way, that today is available with a laptop, and that transformed the era. And but in the early days, and we're talking the late '60s, early '70s, it took a big room. It took a team of engineers and producers and maintenance engineers to make this work. Now you can do it on a laptop in your living room. That's changed a lot of things. And one of the things that it significantly changed, and I think that made that era unique, was because they were in these big rooms, because they were a collaborative experience, the bands played together in the same experience. And there were multiple artists. You have experiences where Jimi Hendrix is in Studio A in New York, and Leslie West is working mountain in the other room, and they could combine. There was synergy and there was collaboration among the artists. Sly Stone, who passed recently, was working with R.E.R. Speedwagon. Stevie Wonder was working with America. So the unique experiences that'll never happen because the technology has changed, and because ultimately that's what we tried to create with this book.
You
to
mentioned
tell about a time that's long gone and most likely will never happen again.
you mentioned Jimi Hendrix, and he figures prominently in the story early on, being brought into basically an empty room with chalk marks on the floor. This is going to go here. This is going to go here.
Yeah,
And
they
I guess
built it
kudos
was
to Hendrix for being able to visualize that.
yeah, it was built for Jimmy. And also it was built so it was comfortable. It was the first studio that where they didn't have to wear lab coats and the union guys were not there to call the shots when lunch was coming, which as a result ended up in the sessions going on and on and on. But many of those outtakes, shall we say, from the Hendrix period at Record Plant in New York and elsewhere, now are still coming out. Without those endless sessions because he was so creative. The creativity was just unending. Also, it was comfortable. He liked it there. He could be having a strawberry milkshake, out in the front desk. And same with John Lennon. It became his second home after the Beatles broke up, and he liked to be around people that were creative. And it was the first studio that had a concierge. If you can imagine what a studio with a five-star hotel. I mean, whatever the artist wanted, they could get it. And of course, they liked spending more time there.
And remember, these were safe environments. They were protected. Within the sanctuary of this of these spaces. They could create. They could do the wildest things they wanted to, and the stories are pretty wild. But the very title of our book, "Buzz Me In," was became the code word in Record Plan LA for access, for celebrity access. You needed to be buzzed in to the space. They were protected. There's a scene in the book where Sly Stone is getting busted in Sausalito years later, and the place that he ran, that he tried to escape from the cops, was at Record Plant because he felt safe there. And you couldn't just get in there unless you were somebody and you were acknowledged. Alas, buzz me in.
One of the other stories in the book it involves an arrest, although a fake one, is the arrest of Bob Ezrin during a
Oh boy.
recording session. That is maybe my favorite story so far that I've come across in the book.
Well, he deserved it because he pulled pranks on the guys endlessly. They would throw a young engineer into working with Bob Ezrin, and if the guy survived for a week, he might become a big time engineer someday, and if not, never seen again.
But Ezrin had there was a method to his madness. For those who don't know, Ezrin's most famous for two at Record Plant in New York, at two Alice Cooper records within the year, Schools Out and Billion Dollar Babies, and then obviously all the work he did with Kiss. And there were some pranks. Record Plant in New York was noted for firefights with fire extinguishers and taping people, gaffer taping people to the chairs and blowing things up and whatever. And Ezrin was notorious for. He, in those early days, was a wonder kid. He could do no wrong. He was making hit records, but he had a method to his madness because he realized by making it fun, by doing the unexpected, by doing the extreme, he further inspired the artist. And so it wasn't him just being wild, although it did follow the tradition of Keith Moon blowing up drum sets and throwing equipment out the windows. Ezrin had a method and it worked. And like David said, he trained some of the greatest engineers of all times and producers of all time. Jack Douglas, who worked obviously with Aerosmith and John and Yoko, and of course, most significantly, and not most significantly, also significantly, Jimmy Iovine. Not only his work with Lennon and Springsteen and Tom Petty, and obviously becoming a billionaire headphone entrepreneur. So Ezrin was successful, and he had a method to his madness.
When I think of the Record Plant Studios, I think of the sound that you got, and they seem to be different. And I don't know if that's because of the facilities, the studio itself, or the producer. But an album like American Pie Don McLean, that Ed Freeman did, and you talk about it in the book. And to me, that had an airiness to it. And one of my
Hmm.
other favorite albums recorded on the other coast was Hotel California
Oh
with
yeah.
Bill Zimzik. I mean, those two albums sonically different. How much of that was the studio versus the different producers?
I think it would be a combination because they could get whatever they wanted. But actually, in those days, it was the producer who was aware of the expanse of technology at his service. So that was probably it. But the artists too were integrally involved in getting the sound that they wanted. Especially in rooms where Marty talked about this, where everybody was they were working together at the same time. It creates a different kind of music than if somebody lays down a bass track or the drums and then they send it through the internet now to the guy who's going to do the overdubs and the instrumentation, and then you add the vocal at the end. If you got to get that all at the same time, it creates an incredible energy. And the book takes you inside that world where, I mean, and also you got to remember these guys, they had a big hit, they got to get another hit. The pressure in the studio was incredible. It's just amazing that they could go on and top themselves in album after album. And because the audience in those days listened carefully. I just listened to Fleetwood Mac Rumors yesterday in my, you know, uh, big stereo system. I love stereo. And if you get in the sweet spot, which was probably the middle of the console where they're recording, uh, the tricks and things that were going on to capitalize on suddenly this high fidelity and stereo. It was a workshop. It was it was a playhouse to surprise themselves and then surprise the audience.
These
But
songs.
I'm
No,
sorry,
go
Jim.
ahead,
Go ahead.
Morton. Go ahead.
What other place can you tie together Jimi Hendrix, Stevie Wonder, John Lennon, Bruce Springsteen, Sly Stone, Aerosmith, Fleetwood Mac in one story, right? Record plant, and there were three record plants. It was New York, Los Angeles, and Sausalito, plus trucks running around to concerts all over the country, of course. It was the Zelig of rock and roll, and if you look at it in that perspective, and what was unique about it was not the sound, because they could get, like David said, whatever sound the artist or producer wanted. It was the environment where the creating an environment where the artist could create, and that was what was unique about it.
That list of artists, Martin, that you just mentioned, basically the soundtrack of our lives recorded in these rooms. And the stories in the book are absolutely amazing. I highly recommend that you read it. Martin Porter, David Goggin, the book, Buzz Me In Inside the Record Plant Studios. Thank you very, very much for your time this morning, and
Thank
best of
you.
luck with the
Thank
book.
you, Jim. Get
Jim, thank
buzzed.
you. Good talking to you.